Actually, the U.S. government itself does an annual report on human rights, and it does have some positive elements with regards to the abuse of Palestinian rights and the continued occupation and its authoritarian practices in Palestine. But nothing is done about it. I mean, the report is issued year after year after year, and it's not reflected in policy because the policy has been politicized.
The Palestinian American community activism in the United States is always aimed to make the suffering of the Palestinian people under the Israeli colonial settler occupation visible to the public opinion in the United States and in the Western countries in general, and also to affect the American foreign policy when it comes to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. In order to talk about all that, I have with me from Washington, D.C. via Skype, Dr. Khalil Jahshan, the Executive Director of the Arab Center, Washington, D.C., and political analyst and media commentator. Dr. Khalil is Palestinian American coming from the Palestinian city of Nazareth. Welcome to our program, Dr. Khalil.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
You're welcome. The Palestinian community political activism, how do you see it in terms of its structure, organization, impact on the public opinion in the United States, as well as the possibility of having an effect on the American foreign policy towards the cause of the Palestinian people?
Well, as most of your audience knows, the United States of America is an immigrant society. It has hundreds and hundreds of different ethnicities, different religions, different backgrounds that immigrated over the years for more than 200 and almost 40 some years to the United States. And all these communities tend to rally together in order to kind of survive, to adjust to their new homeland, to push for their own, to achieve their own rights, their own social and political objectives. So the Palestinian community, as well as the larger Arab American community, are not the exception to this rule. They have done the same. They have, since their arrival to this country more than a century ago, at least 120 years ago, Arabs who immigrated to America tried as much as possible to try to organize, to try to keep as much as they could of their culture as they assimilated to the American way of life. Generally speaking, that community numbers today between 3.5 to 4 million people who are of Arab origin. In addition, of course, they overlap members of the Muslim American community, which is larger. It's about 7 to 8 million Americans of Muslim origin, because some of them are non-Arab, of course. They come from various parts of the Muslim world, including some who are also American citizens, particularly in the African American community. So there is at least 1.2 million overlap between Arab Americans and Muslim Americans. The history of activism among Palestinian Americans, whose immigration is usually traced, generally speaking, to the years prior to World War I, with upheavals and events in the region, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the British Mandate, and later, of course, the end of the British Mandate over Palestine, and the establishment of the State of Israel. That created, if you will, a dilemma for the Palestinians in terms of the dispersion that was created by the State of Israel. So some of the Palestinian refugees ended up in the U.S. So today we estimate, like I said, about 400,000 Americans of Palestinian origin. Some of them are still intact in terms of old local identities. For example, the largest subgroup within the Palestinian community tends to be the Federation of Ramallah clubs in the United States, where Americans of Ramallah background tend to probably outnumber the original population of Ramallah in Palestine. There is more than probably 45 to 50,000 American citizens of Ramallah origin. And of course, they have been immigrating to this country, some of them even going back to the late 1800s. Political activism is the nature of doing things in America. America, the United States of America, is generally speaking, internally, a democratic country in the sense that it allows people to organize, to vote, and to seek to influence policy. The term that we know as in political jargon as lobbying, which is considered a right for all groups in the States. So that is more recent. It didn't start till, I would say, the mid to late 60s in this country. The 67 war was the crucial turning point particularly for Palestinian Americans, as well as for Arab Americans in general. The war that took place, the results of that war, the defeat of 67, and Nakba was joined with a Naksa, and that created some momentum within the Palestinian American community for the need to organize and to explain their cause, to explain what happened in their land of origin to fellow Americans, because they felt that the problem in U.S. foreign policy is lack of objective and lack of real information and recent information about the conflict.
Yeah, and if we talk about the mainstream media in the United States and how it used to handle the Palestinian cause, and today we see how the mainstream media in the West in general is handling the crisis in Europe, the Ukrainian crisis. How would the Palestinian community and the Palestinian activists make use of that, if it's possible to say that, and to show the American public opinion that the media, the general policies of the country there is biased and not objective? How can we utilize the current situation, I mean?
Media bias, frankly, has been the enemy for Arab Americans and Palestinian Americans over the years for a long, long time. Lack of information, lack of coverage, bias toward one party, that is Israel versus the Palestinian perspective. So all that, the fact that there is a sizable Jewish community that existed before the conflict even started in the United States, that led to the fact that a sector in American society inherited that bias from the media. In other words, the media reinforced the stereotypes that existed before. And the false information that was spread over the years, over many, many years of propaganda about the conflict in the region, whether it's the Palestine conflict or subsequent wars that emerged from it in 56, in 67, in 82, etc. So when you look back, for somebody like me who came here to the States as a student in 1969, I've been able to witness a massive sea change in attitudes and a sea change in media coverage compared to what we used to see in 69 or 70. A lot of the bias has been reduced, but still there are some serious gaps. Of course, today's media, when we talk about it, it's a totally different media system, communication system than it existed 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 30 years ago. Unfortunately, people in the Arab world have not adjusted to that well enough. A lot of the attempts to reach to the American public, to American officialdom, tend to be antiquated, have not really caught up. Today, it's a bit easier for the younger generation because the media has been both localized and individualized. Anyone can tweet, anyone can depict his or her own version of the conflict and get some followers to focus on that. People no longer depend on newspapers or magazines or even traditional TV. Today, people depend mostly on the internet as the main source of their information. on international affairs. And that is true in the States as well as it's true in Palestine. I mean, people, young people particularly, know what I'm talking about. So things are changing, and I think one cannot deny that this has impacted the American public opinion in general. I think there is a better understanding for the conflict, and that usually tends to be in favor of the Palestinian perspective, and that's why the other side, the Israeli side, is worried about some of the opinions that are voiced on the new media these days by young people, including, by the way, American Jewish young people who do not espouse the old Zionist narrative about what happened in Palestine and the rationale for establishing the State of Israel. So therefore, they kind of view, for example, campuses in the United States as enemy territory because of the sympathy that exists on many campuses for the Palestinian cause. So change is happening. It's a little bit slow. There are still some, as I said, pockets of resistance and challenges that need to be overcome. But it is happening for the better. And hopefully, eventually, there will be a better understanding and better impact, which was, reflected in your question earlier. The impact is what's so important. And thus far, frankly, even though there is some public opinion that has become more favorable to the Palestinians, that hasn't been reflected in policy, whether it's Palestinian American public opinion, Arab American public opinion, or just general American public opinion. That hasn't been reflected in the policy. The policy tends to remain biased, and there has to be more concentrated effort by people here in the States and by people in Palestine to make
that is my following question, Dr. Khalil, that you're talking about change, and is this change due to the political level? I mean, does it affect the policies of the American administration, or it is a change because of the social media and because of the Palestinian youth who are very active on social media and their ability to reach out to the American public? And in this context, let me talk about the American Secretary of State. Just 2 or 3 days ago, he was in the region here, and he participated and sponsored the Nakab summit between the Israeli government officials and some foreign ministers, some Arab officials. So does this mean that the social media and the change that you have already talked about does not affect the political level, the administration?
It does, but not enough. Rest assured that the Secretary of State, with his, let's say, stop in Ramallah to meet not only with the leadership, but he also met with different, individuals, civilians, civil figures in Palestinian society, civil leaders, human rights organizations, and others, businessmen, and what have you. That could not have happened in the past, could not have happened without that change. There is a strong trend within the Democratic Party, with this administration, of course, being the White House is occupied by a Democratic president belonging to the Democratic Party. That internal lobby within the party has not allowed, if you will, the traditional bias to continue, where people come to Jerusalem, they meet with Israeli leaders in Tel Aviv, they visit Jewish places, and somehow the Palestinian side is totally ignored as if that doesn't exist. So the Secretary of State had to do that, even though he is prone himself, personally, knowing his own political views on this. I can assure you that he was not necessarily resisting that, but still, I don't think those gestures are beyond symbolic. They need to be much more politically studied and become more effective in supporting the realization of Palestinian rights. But look at the summit you referred to, the Sde Boker summit in the Nakab. with all due respect, the American participant comes to Ramallah to pay respect to the Palestinians, yet the Arab leaders who participated in it, none of them even bothered to do that. So there is a realignment in the region that is not necessarily Palestinian friendly. And even though many in the past, including presidents of the United States, used to tell us that, hey, you don't want me to be more pro-Arab than the Arabs. Unfortunately, this new tendency in the Arab world, the new realignment, is probably restoring that impression by American politicians that the Arabs do not care as much. The American people, they know that. The Arab people do stand by the Palestinians. Public opinions are very clear. Those opinion polls conducted by Arab Center, the Arab Index, shows that very clearly. As a matter of fact, in some Arab countries, like in Algeria, for example, more Arabs support Palestine and consider Palestine Arab than in Palestine itself. The numbers reach 94, 96% of the Arab public opinion support Palestinian rights. That is not reflected in Arab policies and definitely is not totally reflected in US policy.
Yes, and Dr. Khalil, my final question to you, as you mentioned the meetings held by the Secretary of State, Mr. Blinken, with some civil society organizations here in Ramallah and meeting with the Palestinian leadership at the same time. This leads me to talk about the human rights reports, the very important human rights reports issued by Amnesty International and also by Human Rights Watch, as well as the Special Rapporteur of the United Nations on the human rights situation in the Palestinian occupied territories. How these reports, these international reports, reflect themselves into the American policy, and what is requested from the Palestinian activists and all those who support the Palestinian cause in order to have more impact for these reports?
Yeah, look, it's not only these international reports, human rights organizations and international agencies that do that. Actually, the US government itself does an annual report on human rights, and it does have some positive elements with regards to the abuse of Palestinian rights and the continued occupation and its authoritarian practices in Palestine, but nothing is done about it. I mean, the report is issued year after year after year, and it's not reflected in policy because the policy has been politicized. The spillover of foreign policy into domestic policy allowed domestic policy to control, if you will, and to limit the rational component of policy making. It's not done in the national interest. It's not done, if you will, in terms of principles that the U.S. prides itself on human rights. The same thing applies to these international Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, B'Tselem, the UN most recently. The statements by the rapporteur is clearer than ever. Still, U.S. policy not only doesn't take him into consideration in its policy making, but doesn't even support him. The U.S. administration, as committed as it claims to civil rights and political rights, including what we have heard ad nauseum every day in Ukraine, somehow that is not applicable to Palestine.
Yes, Dr. Khalil Jahshan, Executive Director of the Arab Center, Washington, D.C. It has been a great pleasure having you on our program. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
And ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for watching. And from me, Osama Nazal, have a nice time.